Welcome to a new original werewolf shifter romance written and crafted by Trisha Emanuel. They say a public rejection from your mate is a fate worse than death. But what happens when the rejected outcast survives to become the queen of the most powerful alpha in the realm? Let's find out. Chapter 1. The Cursed Healer. The pup's whimper was a tiny, sharp thing, a needle of sound in the quiet clearing. My fingers, stained with the green of crushed marigold root, hovered over the deep gash in his flank. Other pack members watched from a distance, their forms like statues among the ancient oaks, their whispers like the rustling of dead leaves. They never came close when I worked. Not anymore. Breathe, I told myself, letting the pup's frantic energy flow through me, tasting his fear in the air. It was a bitter metallic tang like blood and panic. I was a healer. I was a fixer of broken things. It was the only value I had left to offer because everything else about me was apparently tainted. The paste I'd made was cool against my skin. Gently, so gently, I smoothed it into the wound. The little wolf flinched, a tremor running through his small body, but he didn't snap. Animals were easier than people. They didn't care that my mother had died birthing me, a supposed curse on her own blood. They didn't know my father had vanished weeks later, branded a deserter who couldn't bear the shame. Animals just knew pain, and they knew when someone wanted to help. The pup's breathing began to even out, the frantic beat of his heart slowing under my palm. A quiet victory. It was all I had. Beyond the clearing, life went on. The scent of roasting boar wafted from the communal fire, a rich, smoky promise of the mating ceremony tonight. It was a night for hope, a night for destiny, a night where the moon goddess was said to reveal the other half of your soul. For years, I had held on to that tradition like a drowning wolf clinging to a log. Maybe tonight someone would finally see me. Not the outcast, not the healer who lived in the shadows, just Elara. Was it so much to ask? To be wanted? To be chosen? To be seen for something other than the tragedy of my birth? Consequently, as I wrapped the pup's leg in clean moss, my own heart ached with a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical wound. I was good at mending flesh and bone, but who was there to mend me? I belonged nowhere. A ghost in my own home, a whisper on the wind, a half-forgotten story told to scare unruly children. The pup licked my hand, his tiny tongue rough as sand. I offered him a weak smile, my only ally in a world that held me at arm's length. A twig snapped behind me, loud, deliberate, and impossibly close. My head shot up and my breath caught in my throat. It was him, Darius. The alpha heir was walking straight toward me. He moved with the easy grace of a born predator, all lean muscle and coiled power. Darius. His scent hit me first. A heady mix of pine, winter frost, and something that was purely him, purely alpha. It sent a jolt straight through me, a dizzying electric shock that was both terrifying and wonderful. The fated mate bond. It was real. Every story, every whispered legend. It was all true. For the first time, hope felt less like a distant dream and more like a tangible thing I could almost reach out and touch. "Your work is impressive," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. He stopped just a few feet away, his dark eyes fixed not on me, but on the now sleeping pup. I didn't think anyone could soothe the Fenrir hounds. They're notoriously vicious. I found my voice, though it felt small and shaky. "He's just scared. Pain makes everything vicious." My gaze flickered up to his face, taking in the strong line of his jaw and the confident curve of his lips. He was even more handsome up close. The goddess had blessed me. She had to have. Why else would she give me to him? Darius finally looked at me then, and for a breathtaking second I saw it. A flicker of confusion, a widening of his pupils as our shared scent truly registered. The bond was singing between us, a silent, powerful music only we could hear. His focus was intense, a physical weight that pinned me in place. But just as quickly as it appeared, the recognition was gone. replaced by a cool, assessing glance that traveled down my worn leather tunic and back up again. It wasn't the look of a mate finding his other half. It was the look of a man appraising livestock. "You're the healer, then," he stated, a hint of dismissal in his tone. "Elara, the daughter of the deserter." The word hung in the air, sharp and ugly. The beautiful music of the bond stuttered, replaced by a dissonant clang of shame. I flinched because his words were meant to hurt. I could feel it. It's a pity. A tainted bloodline is a weakness our pack can't afford in its leadership. The hope inside me curdled. A pity. He spoke of destiny, of our souls, as if it were a business transaction. He was declining. The pain was so sharp, so sudden, it was like being stabbed. I wanted to scream, to demand he take it back, but my throat was tight with unshed tears. Was this it? Was this how my dream died? He gave me a lazy, arrogant smile, completely oblivious, or perhaps completely indifferent, to the way he was shattering me. "Still," he drawled, his eyes glinting with a possessive light that had nothing to do with love. "A mate is a mate. The ceremony is tonight. Don't be late." He turned and walked away, leaving me reeling in a daze of confused, heartbroken hope. He was my mate, but it was clear he already considered me a burden. I walked away from Darius in a stupor, my feet moving automatically toward the gathering grounds while my mind replayed his every word. A tainted bloodline. A weakness. The phrases echoed, each one a fresh crack in my fragile heart. How could the goddess be so cruel? To give me the gift of a mate, the one thing I'd wanted my entire life, only to have him see me as a flaw, a stain on his perfect future. It made no sense. This connection between us was a living thing, a current of energy that pulsed with a power I couldn't deny. Why couldn't he feel that? Or did he just not care? "Elara." The voice was soft, papery with age, and it stopped me in my tracks. I turned to see Ara, one of the pack's oldest elders. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles and ancient secrets. Her eyes, usually cloudy, were surprisingly sharp and focused on me. "A word, child." I hesitated. Ara rarely spoke to anyone but the Alpha. "Of course, Elder." She beckoned me closer away from the main path, her movements slow but deliberate. "I knew your father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He was no deserter. He was one of the most loyal warriors this pack has ever known. Strong, fierce, and honorable to the bone." Her words were a balm on a wound I didn't even know was still bleeding. All my life I'd carried the shame of his abandonment. To hear this, it was like the world tilting on its axis. "Then what happened to him?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why did he leave?" Ara's gaze darted around nervously, as if the trees themselves were listening. "His disappearance was not what it seemed," she said, her voice dropping even lower. "He was looking into things, old secrets, things that powerful wolves wanted to stay buried." She placed a wrinkled hand on my arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "You have his eyes, and I fear you have his heart. Be careful tonight, little wolf. Be very careful who you trust." Her eyes flickered in the direction Darius had gone. "Especially those with too much power and far too much to lose." Before I could ask more, she squeezed my arm once and shuffled away, melting back into the shadows of the forest. I stood frozen, her cryptic warning ringing in my ears. Not what it seemed. Secrets. What did she mean? A cold dread began to seep into my bones, a chilling counterpoint to the thrumming of the mate bond. The sounds of the ceremony grew louder ahead, the drums, the laughter, the joyous howls. I walked toward it, my heart now a battlefield of hope and terror. I was heading toward my destiny, but for the first time, I was afraid of what I might find. The air in the great clearing crackled with energy, a living thing woven from bonfire smoke, roasting meat, and the wild, sharp scent of anticipation. Hundreds of wolves stood in their human forms, their faces upturned and illuminated by the dancing flames. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Ara's warning was a cold stone in my stomach, a stark contrast to the thrumming hum of the mate bond that pulled me inexorably toward Darius. He stood beside his father, the current alpha, looking every bit the king he was born to be. Regal, powerful, mine. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope against a wall of fear. The alpha raised his hands and a hush fell over the crowd. His voice boomed full of authority and pride. Tonight we honor the goddess, we honor the bond, we welcome the future of this pack. His gaze settled on his son. Darius, step forward. Who does the goddess name as your mate? As your Luna? This was it. Time seemed to stretch and thin, every sound magnified, every scent sharp enough to cut. Darius's eyes scanned the crowd, and for one agonizing, breathtaking moment they locked with mine. The bond flared between us, a searing, white-hot connection that surely everyone could see. Please, I prayed to a goddess I wasn't sure was listening. Please let him feel it too. A slow, confident smile spread across his lips. He started walking. He was coming toward me. The crowd parted before him like a wave. But he didn't stop. He walked right past me, his shoulder brushing mine with an indifference that was more painful than a physical blow. The bond shrieked in protest, a silent scream of confusion and betrayal. I turned, my body stiff with disbelief, and watched as he stopped in front of Cassandra, a warrior wolf with a flawless pedigree and eyes as cold as a winter morning. He took her hand, raised it to the sky, and turned to face the pack. To face me. His voice, when he spoke, was not the voice of a mate. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. The goddess has blessed me with a strong partner, he declared, his gaze finding mine again, pinning me with its cruelty. Then he delivered the killing blow. She has shown me that true strength is pure. My line will not be weakened by a tainted, curse-ridden bloodline. A collective gasp rippled through the pack. His words weren't just a rejection. They were a public execution. He called me a lowborn mutt, a stain, and unworthy. The world tilted, the bonfire flames blurring into streaks of orange and yellow through the sudden rush of tears. Laughter started to ripple through the whispers. I stood there shattered into a million pieces while my fated mate, my other half, celebrated his choice with another woman. A wave of nausea, hot and violent, churned in my stomach. I had to get out. I ran. The forest was a blur of tangled shadows and grasping branches. As I fled, I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to escape the sound of their laughter and the feeling of their pitying, scornful eyes on my back. I finally collapsed at the base of a giant cypress, my body shaking with sobs that felt torn from my very soul. He had destroyed me. In front of everyone, he had taken my deepest hope and turned it into a weapon against me. The sickness rose again, and this time I couldn't stop it. I was violently ill. The heaving of my body, another layer of misery on a night built of it. And then a terrifying stillness settled over me. It wasn't just the shock. It wasn't just the grief. It was a cold, dawning realization. The nausea, the strange exhaustion I'd felt for weeks, and the way my senses had felt heightened and different. Oh, goddess. No, it couldn't be. But it was a new life. A tiny secret spark I hadn't even known existed. His life, his pup. A desperate, foolish flicker of hope ignited in the darkness of my despair. This changed everything. It had to. A pup. His heir. No alpha could deny his own blood. This wasn't about a tainted bloodline anymore. This was about the future of his own. I had to tell him. He had to know. Fueled by a new frantic energy, I got to my feet and ran back, finding him in a secluded grove near the edge of the celebration, his back to me. "Darius," I choked out, my voice raw. He spun around, his expression hardening into a mask of irritation when he saw me. "What do you want? Haven't you been humiliated enough for one night?" "It's not about that," I whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. The words felt heavy, impossible on my tongue. "Darius, I'm pregnant." I watched his face, searching for any sign of shock, of regret, of anything other than the cold fury that was slowly dawning in his eyes. "It's yours. I'm carrying your pup." For a moment, he just stared. The silence was absolute. I held my breath, praying he would see the truth, that the part of him connected to me by fate would recognize the profound reality of what I was saying. But there was no recognition. There was no connection. There was only a monster. He took a step toward me, his smile a terrifying slash in the moonlight. "A mistake," he hissed, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "A mistake you're going to erase. You and that thing are going to disappear." He grabbed my arm, his fingers biting into my flesh like a steel trap. "Do you understand me?" he snarled, dragging me deeper into the woods, away from the light. Fear was a cold serpent coiling in my gut. Darius's grip was brutal, his strength overwhelming as he half-dragged, half-threw me through the darkened woods. The celebration faded behind us, replaced by the silence of the deep forest. This wasn't just anger. This was something else entirely, something cold and calculated. He was erasing a problem. That's all I was to him now. That's all we were. He finally shoved me hard, sending me tumbling down a short, steep embankment. I landed with a cry, my shoulder slamming against a root, the impact jarring every bone in my body. He stood above me on the ridge, a dark silhouette against the moon. His face was a mask of pure contempt. "I told you to disappear," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Stay gone. If I ever see you again, if you ever breathe a word of this lie to anyone, I will kill you, and I will enjoy it." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned his back on me, on his child, and vanished back into the trees. I lay there, bruised and broken, the cold, damp earth seeping into my clothes. The physical pain was nothing compared to the gaping wound in my soul. He was going to let us die out here. He had taken my hope. He had taken my name. He was trying to take this new life. For a long, long time, I just let the despair wash over me. It was a cold, heavy tide pulling me under. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was better this way to just stop, to let the forest claim me. It would be so easy to close my eyes and let the darkness win. But then something shifted deep inside me. Beneath the layers of pain and humiliation, a flicker of warmth sparked. A tiny, insistent pulse, my pup, my child, an innocent life that had done nothing to deserve this fate. And with that thought came a feeling I hadn't expected. Not sorrow, not despair, but rage. A pure, white-hot fury that burned away the tears and incinerated the pain. How dare he? How dare he decide our fate? This child was not a curse. This child was not a mistake. This child was mine. I pushed myself up, my muscles screaming in protest, a low growl rumbling in my chest. It was a sound I'd never made before, feral, defiant, and utterly my own. I clutched my stomach, a fierce protective instinct flooding every part of my being. He wanted me to disappear. Fine. I would disappear. He wanted me to die. I would live. I would not only survive, I would thrive. I looked not back toward the pack that had cast me out, but forward into the deep, dangerous unknown of the wilderness. My goal was no longer to be accepted. It was simpler now. It was purer. Survive, protect, and one day I would be strong enough that no one could ever hurt us again. Months bled into one another, marked only by the shifting phases of the moon and the slow, steady swell of my belly. The fierce defiance that had fueled my escape had cooled into a hard, quiet determination. I had found a home of sorts, a shallow cave hidden behind a curtain of waterfall mist, a secret place that smelled of damp earth and clean stone. It was here, on a bed of dried moss and scavenged furs, that my world narrowed to a single point of agonizing, all-consuming pain. The first contraction had clenched my body like a giant fist, stealing my breath and leaving me gasping. Now, hours later, the pain was a relentless tide, pulling me under and throwing me back onto the shore of my own screaming consciousness. There was no one to help, no healer to soothe my brow, no mate to lend me his strength. There was only me, the damp cave walls, and the raw, primal reality of birth. I was alone. I had been alone my whole life. But this was a new, terrifying kind of solitude. What if I weren't strong enough? What if I failed him before his life even truly began? As another wave of torment crested, I bit down on a strip of leather to keep from shredding my own tongue. My vision swam. Black spots danced before my eyes. This was the curse they all whispered about, the one that took my mother. It felt real now, a living shadow in the cave waiting to claim me too. But then I felt him, a small, determined shift inside me, a life fighting to be born. That tiny movement was an anchor. It was a promise. This was not my end. It was his beginning. With a final guttural scream that was more animal than human, I bore down, pouring every ounce of will, every scrap of fury, every drop of love into that one last push. The world exploded into white-hot agony and then release. A sudden, shocking emptiness. For a terrifying second, there was only silence broken by my own ragged gasps, and then I heard it. A cry. A thin, reedy wail that cut through the cave's stillness and stitched the shattered pieces of my heart back together. He was here. He was real. I reached for him, my hands shaking, and gathered the tiny, squirming body to my chest. He was so small, so perfect, his face scrunched in a fierce little scowl. He had a dusting of dark hair and eyes that were still sealed against the world. My son, my Kyle. I named him for a story my father used to tell, of a lone wolf who was strong enough to stand against the storm. Tears streamed down my face, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, earth-shattering love. Holding him, I felt a sense of belonging I had never known. We were a pack of two, and I would burn the world down to keep him safe. The first few weeks with Kyle were a blur of sleeplessness and a love so fierce it was a physical ache in my chest. Survival was no longer an abstract concept. It was a daily, desperate dance. It was the hunt for food, the search for clean water, and the constant, vigilant watch for danger. I was a healer by nature, but necessity had made me a hunter. I learned to read the forest's secrets, the subtle press of a deer's hoof in the mud, the nervous chatter of squirrels that signaled a predator nearby, the way the wind carried a scent. In the beginning, I failed more than I succeeded. I came back to the cave empty-handed more times than I could count, my stomach a hollow pit of failure, Kyle's hungry cries a symphony of my own inadequacy. But I learned. I had to because his survival depended entirely on me. I learned to set snares that were clever and cruel. I learned to move with a silence that rivaled the forest shadows. I learned to kill with a swift, clean efficiency that the girl I used to be would never have recognized. I would whisper apologies to the spirits of the rabbits and squirrels. I performed a strange ritual of gratitude and grief. I fashioned a sling from vines and soft hide, and Kyle spent most of his days strapped to my chest, a warm, precious weight against my heart. He was a quiet baby, his dark eyes taking in the world with a solemn curiosity that reminded me so much of the stories about my father. Was this what he was like? Strong, silent, observant? One afternoon, while foraging for berries, I found a patch of wild ginger root. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. My father is showing me the same plant. "This is a warrior's root, Elara," he had said, his voice a warm rumble. "It settles the stomach and calms the spirit. Never forget the gifts the earth gives us." I hadn't forgotten, and now I used that gift to make a tea that soothed Kyle's colicky cries. Because I was a provider, a protector, and a mother, I grew stronger. My body, once soft from a healer's life, became lean and hard. My senses, always sharp, honed themselves to a razor's edge. I could smell a coming rainstorm hours before it arrived. I could hear the heartbeat of a mouse hiding in the undergrowth. This was my new reality. It was a hard life, a lonely life, but it was our life. One crisp morning, tracking a young buck, I pushed deeper into an unfamiliar part of the woods. The air grew still. The forest went quiet. A predator's silence. It wasn't the buck I had been tracking. A low growl echoed from the trees to my left, and I realized my mistake too late. I had stumbled out of my small, safe world and into someone else's territory. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. I froze, my hand flying instinctively to Kyle, who was sleeping soundly in his sling. The growl came again, closer this time, and it was joined by another, then another. They were surrounding me. Slowly, I backed away, my eyes scanning the dense woods. I saw them then. 3 of them were huge, mangy rogues with scarred muzzles and eyes that burned with a feral, mindless hunger. They weren't pack wolves. They were broken things driven mad by solitude and desperation. And they saw me for what I was. A lone female, burdened with a pup, easy prey. My own wolf rose within me, a surge of protective fury that drowned out the fear. There was no room for terror now. There was only the primal, absolute need to protect my son. I didn't hesitate. I let the shift take me. The change was a firestorm of snapping bone and tearing flesh, a pain I welcomed because it was a weapon. I landed on 4 paws, my form larger and leaner than it had ever been, a low snarl ripping from my throat. I was no warrior. I was a healer, but they didn't know that. They would not touch my son. The largest rogue lunged, a blur of matted gray fur and yellowed teeth. I met him head-on, my own fangs sinking into his shoulder. He howled, a sound of surprise and pain, and his 2 companions rushed in. It was a chaotic, brutal dance of claws and teeth. I fought with a savagery I never knew I possessed. I fought for my life. I fought for Kyle's future. I fought with the untamed soul of a mother pushed past her limit. I was faster than they were, my smaller frame giving me an agility they lacked. I dodged. I weaved. I tore at their flanks, my mind a red haze of pure instinct. One of them managed to land a blow, his claws raking across my ribs. The pain was a searing agony that nearly made me black out, but it only fueled my rage. I lunged, locking my jaws around his throat, and I didn't let go until his struggles ceased. The other 2, seeing their packmate fall, hesitated. They saw the bloodlust in my eyes, the promise of death, and their feral cunning won out over their hunger. With snarling whimpers, they turned and fled into the woods. Shaking and bleeding, I shifted back, collapsing to my knees. Kyle was awake, his little face staring up at me, his eyes wide but unafraid. I was a mess of blood, mine and theirs, and deep, ragged gashes. I had to get back to the cave. I had to heal. Staggering to my feet, I started the long, painful journey back, leaning heavily against the trees. That's when I smelled it, a new scent on the wind cutting through the metallic tang of blood. It was powerful, organized, a full pack patrol, and at its head an alpha. An alpha whose power was so immense, so overwhelming, it felt like a physical force. This was no ordinary leader. This was the scent of a king. The scent of rogue blood was a foul, coppery stain on the clean air of my territory. It was mingled with the stench of feral desperation and the sharp, clean tang of a lightning strike. Ozone and fury. My patrol moved in silence, our paws making no sound on the forest floor. I had expected to find the aftermath of a territorial squabble, a messy, pathetic end for some mangy outcast. I did not expect to find her. She was backed against a massive moss-covered boulder, her body a canvas of blood and bruises. Yet she stood with the defiant stillness of a cornered wolf. She was clutching a pup to her chest, her arm a protective shield. Her eyes, they were not the wild, crazed eyes of a rogue. They were intelligent and fierce, and they met my gaze without a single flicker of submission. A low growl rumbled from her chest, a promise of death she was in no condition to deliver. Yet I believed her all the same. My wolves fanned out, surrounding her, their own growls a low thunder. She didn't even flinch. Something shifted inside me. A rusted, ancient gear grinding into motion. For years, my world had been governed by a single cold principle. Threats are to be eliminated. My pack's safety was absolute, a fortress I had built around a hollow core. Betrayal had taught me that mercy was a weakness, that emotion was a liability. I had turned my heart to ice because it was the only way to ensure it could never be shattered again. Rogues were a disease, and I was the cure. Simple, clean, final. But looking at her, nothing was simple. I saw the ragged gash on her ribs, the exhaustion trembling through her limbs, and the unyielding fire in her soul. She was broken, but she was not beaten. She was a warrior, a mother, a survivor. She was everything I had once admired and everything I had learned to distrust. My beta Kale took a step forward, his own snarl echoing in the sudden quiet. "Alpha?" he questioned, waiting for the inevitable command to attack. I raised a hand, stopping him. The word kill was on my tongue. It was the logical command, the right command, but it wouldn't form. I found myself captivated by the sheer force of her will, a quiet strength that seemed to push back against the crushing weight of my own authority. Sparing her was a risk. Bringing a rogue and her unknown pup into my territory was insanity. It violated every rule I had ever made, and yet I couldn't bring myself to destroy something so fiercely, beautifully alive. "Stand down," I commanded, my voice rougher than I intended. I looked at the female and at the pup she guarded so ferociously, and I made a decision that was not born of logic, but of an instinct I thought had died long ago. "Take them. Heal her. She is under my protection." The room they gave me was more luxurious than any place I had ever stayed, yet it felt like the most opulent cage in the world. There were soft furs on the bed, a fire crackling in a stone hearth, and a plate of roasted chicken left on a small table. I hadn't touched it. I sat on the edge of the bed, Kyle sleeping in my lap, my body rigid with suspicion. This Alpha King, Lucian, they called him, made no sense. He should have killed us. That's what alphas did to rogues. They didn't offer them shelter and protection. This had to be a trap, a game. And I refused to be the pawn. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and he entered. The Ice King. The air in the room instantly grew colder, charged with his immense power. He was even more intimidating in the firelight, his face carved from hard lines and shadows, his silver eyes holding a chilling emptiness. He said nothing, simply stood by the door, his gaze sweeping the room before it landed on me. It was not a warm look or even a curious one. It was the detached assessment of a king surveying a new, unpredictable piece of his territory. Fear, sharp and familiar, pricked at me. I clutched Kyle closer, my own wolf rising to the surface, ready to snarl. I would not show weakness, not to him. But Kyle, my sweet, fearless boy, chose that moment to wake up. He blinked his dark, sleepy eyes, not at me, but at the giant, intimidating man by the door. And then he did something that made my heart stop. He smiled. He squirmed out of my lap, and before I could grab him, he toddled on his unsteady legs straight toward the most dangerous man I had ever met. "Kyle, no," I whispered, scrambling after him. But it was too late. Kyle reached the Alpha King and, without a hint of fear, placed his small, chubby hand on the king's leather-clad knee. A touch so innocent, so simple. The king went rigid. His silver eyes, which had been so cold and empty, suddenly widened. A storm of emotion flashed across his face. Shock, disbelief, and a pain so raw and profound it stole my breath. It was a fleeting, unguarded glimpse into a shattered soul. He looked down at my son's hand as if it were a hot coal, his jaw clenched, his throat working. He had a vision. I realized Kyle's touch had broken through his icy walls and shown him something. Something that hurt. Just as quickly as the storm appeared, it was gone. He pulled his leg back as if burned, and without a single word, turned and strode from the room, slamming the door behind him. I was left staring after him, my fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a bewildering question. Who was this man? And what ghost had my son's touch just awakened? For 2 days, I saw no one but a quiet female who brought me food and fresh bandages. I learned her name was Maeve, and her eyes held a gentle curiosity, but she offered no information, and I asked for none. I was a prisoner, I told myself, a curiosity on display. The king's strange reaction to Kyle meant nothing. It was all a prelude to some crueler fate. On the 3rd day, Maeve insisted I needed fresh air. Reluctantly, I agreed, holding Kyle tightly as she led me to a walled garden at the heart of their fortress. The pack members I passed stared openly. Their whispers followed me like a cloud of biting insects. Rogue filth. Why is she here? The words were the same ones I'd heard my whole life. They were a bitter, familiar poison. I ignored them, lifting my chin, my face a mask of indifference I didn't feel. I sat on a stone bench, letting Kyle play with a loose pebble at my feet, pretending I couldn't feel the weight of their judgment. Then a voice, loud and sneering, cut through the quiet murmur. "Look at it," a burly, scar-faced warrior said to his friends, gesturing toward us with his chin. "The king brings rogue trash into our home. How long until they slit our throats in the night?" His companions chuckled. My blood ran cold. The man took a step toward us, a cruel smirk on his face. "Maybe we should get rid of the problem before it starts." Before I could even react, another presence descended upon the garden, a wave of cold, absolute authority that silenced every bird, every whisper, every breath. Lucian. He had appeared from nowhere, moving with a predator's silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were quiet, but they cut through the air like shards of ice. "Is there a problem, Torin?" The burly warrior, Torin, visibly paled. "No, Alpha. Just talking." Lucian took another slow, deliberate step, his silver eyes locked on the warrior. "It sounded to me," the king said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "like you were questioning my judgment. It sounded to me like you were threatening someone under my personal protection." He stopped directly in front of Torin, who was now trembling. Darius had shamed me before hundreds. This king was defending me before his own. The contrast was so stark it made my head spin. Lucian tilted his head. "Let me be perfectly clear. For everyone, she and the pup are mine to deal with. The next person who speaks to her without permission, the next person who even looks at her with disrespect, he will answer to me directly." He let the threat hang in the air, a promise of violence more terrifying than any shout. Torin could only nod, his eyes wide with fear. The king gave him one last cold look before turning his gaze to me. For the first time, his eyes held something other than emptiness. A question. He had protected me, but I had no idea why. And for the first time since I'd fled my old life, I felt a flicker. Not of fear, but of a desperate need to understand the man who had just declared me his. The courage it took to seek him out felt like swallowing fire. After his public defense of me in the garden, I knew I couldn't remain huddled in my room, a ghost in his fortress. I needed answers. I found him in a library, a vast circular room lined with ancient scrolls, the air thick with the scent of old paper and leather. He was standing by a window, staring out at the moonlit mountains, his shoulders tense, a solitary king in a silent castle. He sensed my presence before I even spoke, turning his head slightly. "You wanted to see me." It was a statement, not a question. I took a deep breath, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm. "I wanted to thank you for what you did in the garden. No one has ever stood up for me like that." He turned fully, his silver eyes unreadable in the dim light. "My pack follows my rules," Torin overstepped. His tone was clipped, dismissing the act as simple politics. But I had seen his face and felt the cold fury pouring off him. It was more than that. "He called you a rogue," Lucian stated, his gaze intense. "Where's your pack, Elara?" The question was a key unlocking a door I had kept bolted shut. And for some reason, I felt safe enough to open it. Maybe it was the quiet of the library or the unexpected flicker of humanity I'd seen in him, but the story just spilled out. I told him everything about Darius, the promise of the fated mate bond, and the crushing public rejection. I told him about the pup he'd denied, about the coldness in his eyes when he'd left me for dead in the forest. The words came out in a raw, trembling whisper. Each one was a shard of glass I was finally pulling from my soul. I expected him to mock me, to call me weak. Instead, he just listened. He stood as still as the mountains outside his window, his entire being focused on my story, his silence a strange, comforting presence. When I was finished, a heavy quiet filled the room. He rejected a true mate bond and his own child. Lucian's voice was a low growl, laced with a contempt so profound it was almost shocking. He is not an alpha. He is a coward. The validation, the simple belief in his voice was enough to make me weep. Then he did something I never expected. He looked away, a shadow passing over his face. A mate's betrayal is a unique kind of poison, he murmured, the words sounding like they were dragged from somewhere deep and broken. My own mate, the one the goddess chose for me years ago. She sold my pack secrets to our enemies for a title and a bag of gold. They attacked during the full moon. I lost my father and half my warriors that night because of her. He finally met my gaze again, and for the first time, the ice in his eyes had completely thawed, revealing a landscape of pure, unadulterated pain. I killed her myself, and I swore I would never trust the whims of the goddess or the weakness of my own heart again. In that moment, he was no longer a king. He was just a man, showing me the scars that mirrored my own. Her story echoed in the silence of my fortress long after she left the library. A mate who would throw away a sacred bond, who would discard his own child. It was a level of dishonor I could barely comprehend. It stirred the cold, settled ashes of my own past. Following the conversation, I found myself pacing, a restless energy coiling in my gut. Her father. She had spoken of the elder's warning that he was a loyal warrior whose disappearance was a mystery. It was a loose thread in the tapestry of her tale, and I found I had a sudden, uncharacteristic need to pull it. I didn't deal in mysteries. I dealt in facts. I summoned my pack's lore master, an ancient wolf named Valerius, whose memory stretched back centuries. I need to know about a warrior from the Blood Moon Pack, I commanded, my voice clipped. He vanished years ago. He was Elara's father. Valerius nodded, his cloudy eyes thoughtful. I will check the Alliance scrolls. While he was gone, I found myself drawn back to the garden where I had defended her. She was there with her pup, Kyle, who was chasing a butterfly. A strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through my chest as I watched them. It was a dangerous feeling. The bond I felt with her wasn't the violent, possessive fire of a true mate bond I remembered from my past. This was different. Quieter. Deeper. It felt less like a chain and more like an anchor. What was this connection? Why did the sight of her small, fierce family feel like a balm on my own scarred soul? Valerius returned, his face grim, a dusty scroll clutched in his hand. Alpha, this is disturbing. He unrolled the brittle parchment. Her father was a wolf named Ronan. He was not of the Blood Moon Pack by birth. He was the last surviving son of the Silver Fang lineage, a noble bloodline thought to have been wiped out in the old wars. I stared at him, the implications washing over me. Silver Fang wolves were legendary for their strength and their honor. A noble line. A powerful line. The scroll says he discovered a rot in the Blood Moon Alpha's leadership, Valerius continued, his voice low. It says he was silenced, murdered on the order of Darius's family to protect their secrets. The world tilted. She wasn't the daughter of a deserter. She was the heir to a noble house. A wolf whose blood was purer and stronger than the cowards who had cast her out. As this truth settled, another more powerful realization crashed over me. A seer from a neighboring pack, an old woman with true sight, had once told me of a rare gift from the goddess. A second chance. A new mate for a soul whose first had been torn away by betrayal. I had dismissed it as a foolish myth. But now, looking at Elara, feeling this impossibly deep pull, I knew. A guard burst into the garden, his face pale. Alpha, a messenger has arrived from the Blood Moon Pack. He carries a demand from Alpha Darius. The past was no longer sleeping. It was at my gates, banging for blood. My head was still spinning from our conversation in the library. Lucien's confession had changed everything. He wasn't just a cold, powerful king. He was a wolf who had been wounded as deeply as I had. It forged a strange, unspoken bridge between us. He found me in the garden, his face set like stone, the ancient lore master at his side. He held a scroll in his hand. "Elara," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk about your father." He told me everything. That my father was no deserter, but the noble son of a lost lineage. That he was murdered for his honor. That Darius's entire claim to power was built on a lie. A crime my father had died to expose. The world swam. All my life I had carried the weight of their lies, the shame of a tainted bloodline, and it was all false. The truth was a blinding light, and in its glare my own quiet strength finally felt like it had a source, a history. But before I could even process the tidal wave of that revelation, Lucien's gaze softened with an intensity that made my heart stop. "There is more," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The goddess. She sometimes grants a second chance, a new bond for those who have been betrayed." He didn't need to say the words. I could feel it in the air between us, a truth so profound it hummed like a sacred chord. Us. Just then, a guard appeared, announcing a messenger from Darius. The two worlds collided, the miraculous hope of a new future and the violent hatred of my past. Darius's messenger was arrogant, his message even more so. It was a demand for the return of his stolen property. I and Kyle. Lucien's face became a mask of ice so cold it could have frozen fire. He didn't reply to the messenger. He simply turned and strode toward the fortress's main balcony, which overlooked the central square. I followed, my heart pounding. He stood before his people, his presence so commanding that the entire pack fell silent. His voice when he spoke was not a shout. It was a low, resonant vow that echoed off the stone and settled in the bones of every wolf present. "The Blood Moon Pack has sent a demand," he announced, his silver eyes blazing. "They seek a female Elara and her pup, Kyle." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Then he drew a deep breath, and his voice rolled like thunder. "Let my reply be heard by all. Elara is of the Silver Fang line. She is under my protection. Her son is under my protection. They are part of this pack now. They are part of my family. Any who would seek to harm them will not be met with negotiation. They will be met with the full fury of my kingdom. They will be met with war." The pack erupted in a unified, deafening roar. And as I looked at the king who stood ready to defy the world for us, I knew I was no longer a rogue. I was home. War did not arrive with a warning. It came as a thief in the night, a brutal, screaming tear in the fabric of our peace. The first alarm howl was cut short, a sound of agony that was my only prelude before the scent of strange wolves, acrid and hostile, flooded my territory. They were on us. I was in my study, mapping our patrol routes, and in the next heartbeat, I was moving. My body is already beginning the violent, explosive shift. Bones snapped, sinews stretched. The Ice King was gone, and the alpha wolf erupted in his place, a beast of silver fur and cold, controlled fury. My pack was already moving, my warriors converging on the breach at the western wall. They were disciplined, they were strong. But the attackers, they fought with a rabid, reckless abandon. They were the Blood Moon Pack, and they fought without honor, their only goal to maim and kill. I crashed into their front line, a force of pure kinetic rage. Claws met flesh, a roar of fury. Another wolf fell. My mind was a razor-sharp calculator of the battle, assessing threats, exploiting weaknesses, and protecting my warriors. Yet underneath the cold calculus of combat, a hot, frantic terror was coiling in my gut. Elara, Kyle. They were in the fortress, in the rooms I had given them, the place I had promised would be safe. I had made a vow to protect them, a public declaration that had painted a target on their backs. This was my fault because I had let my guard down, because I had allowed a flicker of warmth into my frozen world. I had invited this serpent into my garden. The thought was a spur driving me to fight with even greater ferocity. I had to end this. I had to get back to them. As I tore through another attacker, a chilling realization struck me. This was too easy, too straightforward. Darius was a coward, but he wasn't a fool. His forces were strong, but they were throwing themselves at the strongest part of my defenses. This wasn't an invasion. It was a diversion. My head snapped up, my senses straining past the immediate chaos back toward the fortress. The main battle was here at the wall. But the true objective, the real treachery, was somewhere else. A small elite force could have easily bypassed this manufactured chaos. They weren't trying to take my kingdom. They were trying to take my queen. I threw back my head and let out a command howl that cut through the din of battle, a desperate, furious order for my personal guard to fall back to the fortress. But I knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that turned the ice in my veins to dread. I was already too late. The sounds of the attack were a distant, terrifying storm. Growls, screams, the sickening crunch of bone. It was the soundtrack to the end of the world. My first and only instinct was Kyle. I snatched him from his cradle, his small body warm and trusting against my chest. The fortress was supposed to be the safest place, but every shadow now seemed to hold a threat. Maeve! The quiet female who had tended to me burst into the room, her eyes wide with fear. The safe room! She yelled over the din. Alpha's orders! We have to get the pup to the mountain's heart! We ran down stone corridors that echoed with the alarms deeper into the fortress. My entire world had shrunk to the precious weight in my arms. He was all that mattered. As we rounded a corner into a long torchlit hall, they appeared. Not a wave of attackers, but 4 of them. They moved with a chilling purpose, appearing from the shadows as if they were born from them. They weren't here to fight. They were here for us. Maeve bravely put herself between us, her body shifting, a snarl on her lips, but they were too fast, too strong. One of them dispatched her with a single brutal blow that sent her crashing into the wall. My own wolf surged, a wave of desperate fury. I put Kyle down behind me, shielding him with my body, and met their charge with a snarl of my own. I was ready to die here, to fight to my last breath for him. But the leader, a wolf with a cruel, familiar scar across his muzzle, just smiled. He didn't want to fight. They flanked me, their movements a coordinated, predatory dance. One feinted left, and as I moved to counter, another grabbed Kyle from behind me. A scream tore from my throat, raw and hopeless. I lunged, but the scarred wolf blocked me, his body an immovable wall. I saw my son, my entire world, struggling in the arms of a monster, his little face contorted in fear. Don't worry, the scarred wolf sneered, his voice dripping with malice. The alpha just wants his property back. He held up a single sharp claw. This is the message. Come and get your pup, Elara, alone. They were gone as quickly as they appeared, melting back into the shadows, taking the sound, the light, the very air from the corridor. They left me with nothing but the deafening echo of my own failure. Lucian found me moments later. I didn't see him arrive. I was just staring at the empty space on the floor, at the cold stone where my son had just been. The world was a muffled gray haze. The fighting was over. Lucian's warriors had won, but the victory was a bitter ash in my mouth. My son was gone. Kyle was gone. Darius had him. The thought was a physical blow over and over again. Alone. the wolf had said. Come and get him. Alone. The word was a poisoned dart sinking deep into my oldest wound. Alone. It was all I had ever been. It was all I could ever trust. Elara. Lucian's voice was a low rumble, trying to cut through the fog of my shock. He was kneeling in front of me, his hands on my shoulders, but I couldn't feel his touch. Elara, look at me. We will get him back. I have to get him back, I whispered, the words ragged, my eyes finally focused on his face. You heard the message. I have to go alone. It's a trap for you. Exactly, Lucian growled, his grip tightening. It is a trap. You are not walking into it. A frantic, hysterical energy surged through me. I don't have a choice. He has my son, my baby. My voice rose to a scream. You don't understand. I can't lose him. I have to go. I tried to pull away, to get up, to run, but he held me fast. And I cannot lose you, he roared, his own control finally snapping. The raw anguish in his voice shocked me into stillness. Do you think I will let you walk to your death? That I will let that monster take you too? You can't stop me, I sobbed, struggling against him, my fists beating uselessly against his chest. This is my fault. I have to fix it. I can't trust anyone else with his life. I can't. The past was choking me. Darius's betrayal, a lifetime of being abandoned, of being worthless. The fragile trust I had started to build in this place, in this man, shattered. In the end, I was on my own. I always was. Elara. Lucian's voice was softer now, but more intense than any shout. He grabbed my face, forcing me to look at him, his silver eyes boring into mine. This is not the same. I am not him. His voice broke. He left you. He threw you away. I am telling you now, I will not abandon you. I will not let you face this alone. He pulled me into his arms, crushing me against his chest, his body a shield against my own despair. Let me help you, he pleaded, his voice a raw whisper against my hair. Let us save our son. The fight went out of me then, replaced by a wave of soul-crushing despair. He was right. I couldn't do it alone. But Darius had taken everything. And in that moment, huddled in the arms of a king who was offering me the world, all I felt was lost. Despair was a luxury I could not afford. In the aftermath of the attack, I had allowed myself one moment of shared grief with Elara, one moment to hold her while her world and mine crumbled. Then the Alpha King took over. I convened my war council in the Great Hall, the massive oak table covered in maps of the Blood Moon territory. My commanders were grim, their faces etched with the fury of a violated pack. The consensus was singular: a frontal assault. Overwhelm them with sheer force, crush their gates, and burn their fortress to the ground. It was a strategy born of rage, and it was tactically sound. It would also be a bloodbath. As my beta, Kale, detailed our troop movements, a soft voice cut through the grim discussion. You'll be walking into a slaughter, and you'll never get to Kyle in time. All heads turned. It was Elara. She had entered the hall so silently that none of us had noticed. The despair was gone from her eyes, replaced by a cold, glittering fire I had only seen once before, when she had faced down my patrol, a wounded wolf protecting her pup. She was no longer a victim. She was a queen contemplating a chessboard. She walked to the table, her movements fluid and confident. I lived as a rogue in those woods for months, she said, her voice steady. I know them better than Darius's own patrols. The western approach is a swamp. It will slow your forces to a crawl. Her finger traced a path on the map, a path none of my scouts had ever charted. But here, there's a dry ridge hidden by an old rockfall. It leads to the back of the fortress, to the old aqueduct system. Kale scoffed. The aqueducts are sealed. The main gates are, Elara corrected, her gaze unwavering. But the drainage grate for the old cistern is not. It's rusted through. A single wolf could break it open. She looked directly at me, and in her eyes I saw not just a plan, but a deep, cutting understanding of our enemy. Darius is arrogant. He expects an army at his front door, because that is what a proud alpha king would do. He wants a war. What he will never expect is a thief in his own throne room. My commanders began to protest, to speak of honor and the foolishness of a stealth mission. I silenced them with a single look. I looked at Elara, at the fierce intelligence burning in her eyes, at the warrior who had been forged in the very fire Darius had tried to use to destroy her. She was right. Her plan was audacious. It was dangerous. And it was brilliant. It was the gambit of a rogue and the strategy of a queen. In that moment, my admiration for her solidified into something absolute. I would not be the proud alpha king Darius expected. I would be the weapon she needed. I rolled up the map of the frontal assault. We do it her way. The fortress was a hive of quiet, deadly preparation. While the main army made a great show of sharpening blades and preparing for a siege, a grand piece of theater for Darius's spies, our small elite team gathered in the shadows of the armory. There were only 6 of us: Lucian, I, and his 4 most trusted assassins. The weight of what we were about to do settled on me, a cold, heavy cloak of fear. I could be leading them all to their deaths. I could be failing my son all over again. Just as the panic began to coil in my stomach, a warm hand closed over mine. It was Lucian. He led me away from the others into the quiet solitude of a small adjoining chapel lit by a single candle. His silver eyes, usually so guarded, were wide open, filled with an emotion that made my breath catch. He didn't speak. He simply reached into his tunic and pulled out a necklace. It was a simple leather cord, but hanging from it was a pendant of polished silver intricately carved into the shape of a wolf's paw, his pack's symbol. "My mother gave this to me," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "She said it represents our pack's heart, strength, loyalty, unity." He gently placed the cord around my neck, his fingers brushing against my skin, sending a jolt of warmth through me. The silver was cool against my collarbone. "It belongs with you now. So you remember that you are not walking into that fortress alone. I will be with you. My pack will be with you." Tears welled in my eyes. The lonely, cursed girl who had been cast out by her own pack was being given the heart of another. It was too much. It was everything. I looked up at him, at this impossible king who had seen worth in me when I saw none in myself. And the love I felt for him was so powerful, so overwhelming, it eclipsed the fear completely. I reached up and tangled my fingers in his dark hair, pulling his face down to mine. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, frantic collision, a fusion of fear and hope, of love and the looming threat of death. It was a promise, a vow. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me tight against him. And for a moment, we were the only 2 people in the world, a united front against the darkness. We broke apart, breathless, our foreheads resting against each other. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was no longer in charge. Love was. He had given me his pack's heart, and in return, he had captured mine. We were ready. Together, we walked out of the chapel and back into the shadows, ready to go get our son. We moved through the moonless night like ghosts. The 6 of us were a single silent organism, our movements fluid, our senses a web cast out into the darkness. Elara led the way, her knowledge of this twisted, hostile land a beacon in the gloom. I had never followed another's lead in my life, yet I followed her now without question, because her steps were guided by the fierce, unerring compass of a mother's love. She was not just our guide, she was the very soul of our mission. Her plan was flawless. The hidden ridge she had described was a treacherous, winding path that was invisible from the main valley. We bypassed 2 of Darius's patrols, their scent a foul stain on the wind, their guttural laughter echoing from below. We froze in the shadows, not even breathing until they passed, their ignorance a testament to Elara's strategy. With every step that took us deeper into enemy territory, the tension coiled tighter in my gut. My wolf was a caged beast, snarling at the proximity of the cowards who held Kyle, who had dared to threaten Elara. It took every ounce of my control to keep it leashed. After what felt like an eternity, we saw it. A dark, jagged silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Darius's fortress. It was a brutalist structure of black stone and sharp angles, a monument to a tyrant's ego. It looked impenetrable. From the front, it likely was, but we were not at the front. Elara led us down a steep, wooded slope to the base of the rear wall, to a place where a small, almost forgotten stream trickled out of the rock. "The aqueduct," she whispered, her voice barely a breath of sound. Hidden behind a thicket of thorny vines was exactly what she had promised. A large iron grate, its surface pitted and streaked with rust. This was it. The unlocked back door to a king's castle. My assassins, Kale and the others, immediately set to work, their blades prying at the rusted hinges. The sound of metal groaning against stone was deafening in the silence. I stood guard, my eyes scanning the top of the wall, my senses straining for any sign of discovery. Footsteps above us. We all froze. A guard, his form a dark shape against the sky, walked along the battlements. He paused, looking down into the darkness, directly at our position. I could feel Elara's entire body go rigid beside me. We waited, our lives hanging on the whim of a bored sentry. After a moment that stretched for an eternity, he yawned, turned, and continued his patrol. With a final sharp crack, the grate broke free. An opening, a dark, gaping maw leading into the belly of the beast. We had arrived. The air inside the fortress was stale, thick with the scent of too many wolves and the metallic tang of fear. We moved through the stone passages like vengeful spirits, our path a silent, deadly arrow aimed at the heart of the keep, the throne room. My own heart was a frantic, wild thing, a drum beating a rhythm of terror and rage. Every instinct, every fiber of my being was screaming one name, Kyle. We burst into the throne room, and there he was, Darius, lounging on his stolen throne with a bored, arrogant smirk, as if he were waiting for us. My son was in a gilded cage by his side, his small face stained with tears, his eyes wide with fear when he saw me. The sight of that cage, of my child imprisoned like an animal, shattered the last remnants of the broken girl I used to be. There was only the mother, the wolf, and the queen. "Ah, the happy couple arrives," Darius drawled, rising to his feet. "Come to beg for your little mistake back?" Lucian didn't answer with words. He answered with a roar, a sound of pure, untamed alpha fury that shook the very stones of the room. His assassins moved like shadows, engaging the guards that poured from the antechambers. The room exploded into a maelstrom of violence, but my world had narrowed to two people, my son in the cage and the monster standing between us. Lucian lunged for Darius, a blur of silver and righteous fury. They met in a brutal clash of power, two alphas locked in a deadly dance. I ran for the cage, my fingers fumbling with the lock, my eyes never leaving my son. I could hear the fight raging behind me, the snarls, the grunts of pain. I finally tore the cage door open and swept Kyle into my arms. "Close your eyes, sweet boy," I whispered, shielding his face from the violence. A cry of pain ripped through the air, Lucian's cry. I spun around. Darius had a wicked silver-laced blade, and Lucian had a deep gash in his side. He was staggering, off balance. Darius raised the blade for a final killing blow, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. Time slowed. I saw Lucian, the king who had defended me, who had healed me, who had loved me, about to die for me. A volcano of rage erupted in my soul. I shoved Kyle into the arms of one of Lucian's assassins, and I shifted. The change was not just bone and sinew. It was pure, unadulterated fury made flesh. I was a storm, a reckoning. I slammed into Darius an instant before his blade could fall, my fangs sinking deep into his arm, tearing the weapon from his grasp. He screamed, shocked by my speed, my savagery. He was bigger, perhaps stronger, but he fought for power. I fought for everything. For my son, for my mate, for my own stolen life. He never stood a chance. I backed him against his own throne, the symbol of his lies, and as he stared into my eyes, he finally saw not the weak, cast-off girl he had tried to destroy, but the queen who had come to claim his life. My final lunge was for his throat. The fight was over. Silence, heavy and sudden, fell over the throne room, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing and the soft, terrified whimpers of the defeated guards. My assassins had dispatched Darius's loyalists with lethal efficiency. I pressed a hand to the gash in my side. The pain, a dull throb, compared to the overwhelming, soaring pride that filled my chest. Before me, Elara stood in her human form once more, her body trembling, her face a mask of shock and exhaustion. But in her eyes there was the undeniable fire of a victor. She had not been rescued. She had been the avenger. Kyle was safe, already bundled in the arms of one of my men. The immediate threat was gone. Now the future began. I walked to the center of the room, my gaze sweeping over the survivors. The remaining Blood Moon warriors who had surrendered when they saw their alpha fall were kneeling, their heads bowed in submission. They had seen true power tonight. Not the brittle arrogance of a tyrant, but the unyielding fury of a queen protecting her family. I stood over Darius's body. There was no triumph in the sight of my fallen enemy, only a profound, cold finality. He was a cancer, a rot that had poisoned his pack from the inside out. And now he was gone. It was time to heal. I turned, my voice ringing with an authority that left no room for doubt. "The line of this pack's old alpha is broken," I declared, my voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "His reign built on murder and lies is over." My gaze fell on Elara, who was now holding her son, her fierce protector's stance softening into a mother's gentle embrace. A new era begins. Elara of the Silver Fang line is my mate, my queen. This pup, Kyle, is my heir, and the future alpha of our united packs. A murmur went through the kneeling wolves. Shock, confusion, but also a dawning understanding. They had been led by a coward. Now they were being offered a future under a king and a queen who had proven her strength beyond any doubt. Later, after the fortress was secured and the dead were honored, I found Elara in the quiet of her new chambers. I took a healer's kit and gently began cleaning the cuts and bruises she had earned in her victory. Her hands were still trembling slightly. "It's over," I murmured, my voice softer than I thought possible. "It's finally over." She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and leaned into my touch. The war was done. Now we could finally begin to build our peace. The ceremony was held at dawn. The entire pack, Lucian's wolves and the former Blood Moon members who had sworn fealty, gathered in the great square below the fortress balcony. It was the same place where Lucian had declared me under his protection, the place where our new life had truly begun. The first ceremony I had attended had tried to name me unworthy. This ceremony was about to name me queen. The first had been a public execution of my spirit. This one was a public rebirth. I stood beside Lucian with Kyle held securely in his arms, my son looking out at the sea of faces with a curious, calm expression. I was not the trembling, hopeful girl I had been on that other night. I was a survivor, a mother, a warrior. I wore a simple silver gown, but the intricate wolf's paw necklace Lucian had given me rested against my collarbone, a symbol of the heart he had entrusted to me. I felt no fear, only a profound, steady peace. Lucian turned to me, his silver eyes filled with a love so deep, so absolute, it was a tangible presence. "Elara," he said, his voice a low, intimate rumble meant only for me, though the entire pack watched. "My queen, my mate." He leaned in and I tilted my head, baring my neck to him. The crowd fell into a hushed, reverent silence. I felt the sharp prick of his canines against my skin. A brief, searing pain that was not a wound but a promise, a bond, a claiming. He marked me, his life force pouring into mine. A permanent sacred seal that declared to the world that I was his and he was mine forever. When he pulled back, the mark on my shoulder tingled with a warm, golden energy. He was my second chance, my destiny. He had taken my broken heart and not just mended it, but made it stronger than it had ever been. He had seen a queen when I still felt like an outcast. He took Kyle's small hand and my own, holding us together. "My family," he declared to the crowd, his voice booming with pride. The pack erupted in a unified, joyous roar that shook the mountains. They were not just cheering for their king. They were cheering for their queen, for their prince, for us. Later, as the sun's first golden rays crested the peaks, we stood on that balcony together, just the three of us. We watched the light spill over our new United Kingdom. Lucian's arm was a warm, solid weight around my shoulders. Kyle was held safely between us, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't a ghost. I wasn't a curse. I wasn't a rogue. I was home.